So quick hidush on Perashat Lekha. The pasuk says at the beginning of the parasha, "Vayikach Abraham et Sarai ishto." Who did Abraham Avinu take with him from Haran to Eretz Canaan? He takes Sarah, or Sarai as she was called then, Veit Lot ben Achiv, Lot the son of Haran. Haran, as you know from the earlier parasha, he died in Ur Kasdim before the family went to Haran. So he took Lot, his nephew, Veit Kol Lekhu Sham L'Shelach, and they took all their property. And they took with them the souls that they made in Haran. So remember, they come from Ur Kasdim, they get to Haran. In Haran, they made certain souls. We'll explain that in a moment. That's the purpose of this video. And then they took those souls, nefashot, with them, and they went to Vayabo'u Arsa Kenan. Vayese'u lalechet Arsa Kenan, Vayabo'u Arsa Kenan. So, what does it mean? Ve'et nefesh asher asu beharan. So, let me read to you three perushim, starting with Rabbeinu Se'adya Gaon. This is Perek Yod Bet Lekha, Pasuk Yod. Right? I'm reading to you Rechusham, Mikneson Bakar Ugmanim, Nefesh El Nafus. What is El Nafus? People, Nefashot, people. So Rabbeinu Se'adya says these are people, namely Abadim Ushfachot. These refers, what does it mean? Nefesh Asher Asu Beharan. It means the people that they acquired in Haran. How do you acquire people? Abadim, slaves. Ushfachot, maids. Right? Kanu otam. Kemo asali et ha'chayil hazeh. So that this is, I was reading the Neve Shalom. Good morning, Julie. So to summarize Rabbeinu Se'adya Gaon, he seems to give a simple explanation, which Rabbeinu Se'adya Gaon, by the way, is probably the best, or one of the best mefarshim on the Chumash, in terms of explaining the peshat of the words. So V'et nefesh asher asu beharan refers to human chattel, the human beings that they acquired, slaves. Okay, that's Rabbeinu Se'adya Gaon. Let's look at ankelos. My father used to say ankelos and onkelos for whatever reason. Look at ankelos. V'yat nafshata desha'abidu l'oraita beharan. He says those souls that he subjugated to the Torah. Desha'abidu milashon le'sha'abed, to subjugate. So those souls that he subjugated to the Torah, le'oraita means Torah beharan, meaning there was people who were outside the Torah, who were outside the fold of Abraham Avinu's understanding of God, which, because of course Abraham Avinu was Yahid Bedoro, he was the only one who acquired that knowledge all by himself. So he brought people into his fold and he subjugated them to the Torah. So V'et nefesh asher asu beharan would be like the souls that he educated to the knowledge of God, and thus subjugated them to the kingdom of God. The sha'abidu beharan. You understand? So this is people that Abraham Avinu brought towards God. Let me read you the final perush, and this is Rashi. He says, "Asher asu ve'et nefesh asher asu beharan sheichnisan tachat kanfei hashechina," that he brought them within the wings of the Shekhinah. Abraham megayeret ha'anashim. Abraham Avinu would convert these people. Sarah megayeret ha'nashim. I'm sorry. Abraham Avinu would convert the males. Sarah would convert the women. U'ma'aleh alehem aqadu ke'ilu asam en bai. And in so bringing these people towards God, the pasuk shows, because as asu, they made these people. I mean, they made these people, because when you bring people to God, it's like you created them anew, right? All right, and then she brings the peshat. So that's in line with ankelos, right? But then he says ufshuto shel mikra abadim ushfachot. But the peshat means that they acquired slaves. Shekanu lahem. Kemo asa et kol hakavod hazeh. Another pasuk where it's referring to acquiring human chattel. V'Yisrael osechai lashon kina v'chones. Okay, so anyway, so you see how Rashi, he brings first explanation of ankelos, and then he brings the explanation of Rabbeinu Se'adya Gaon. I don't think there's a contradiction between these two explanations. I actually think that they're very complementary. And the reason I say this is because in Judaism, you can't just acquire a slave. But I don't like the word slave because the word slave has negative connotations. Because in the West, a slave was brutalized and a slave was treated with an abject humiliation and degradation. And we all know, I mean, or many people are aware of the history of slavery in the Western world, where slaves were treated horribly, and not just black slaves. I mean, there was Irish slaves were just simply dehumanized by the British, right? This is just an endemic feature of the Western world, whether it doesn't matter whether the slave owners were blacks and the slaves were white or vice versa. But the point is, slavery was a terrible part of, let's say, I would even say the Gentile world, the Western world. It was just prevalent all over the world. But in Judaism, an Eved, so-called translated as a slave, but not really equivalent to the English slave. But an Eved is given many rights, and there's an entire set of laws that tell us what the rights of an Eved are, right? So I'm using the word slave very loosely because there is no other word in the English language. Perhaps the word servant would be better, right? So let's actually use the word servant. So in Judaism, you don't just acquire a servant. No. In Judaism, when you acquire a servant, the servant is going to be accepting all Torah or mitzvot. Harambam in Lekh Isurei Bi'ah, Perek Yod Gimel, Halacha Yod Aleph, he writes as follows, I'm going to read to you Lashon Harambam. Keshem shemolin matbilim et hagerim, the same way you make tevilah on a proselyte, somebody who wants to convert to Judaism, and you make berit milah on the proselyte. Kach molin umatbilim et ha'abadim hanikachim min hagoyim l'shem adut. If you purchase a male servant from a Gentile, now he's going to be your servant, you have to make milah and tevilah. Halokeach eved min hagoyim. Okay. So that's a law. Now, at this point, the Eved, after you acquire him and after he makes the milah and tevilah, just like a ger, he's hayab b'misvot aseh, like women are hayabot b'misvot. B'misvot aseh she'en hazeman gerama, right? Shelo hazeman gerama. Misvot aseh that are not dependent upon time, just like women, and the hayavim the abadim are hayavim b'misvot lo ta'aseh. So that's an important law. And here we see the connection between the two explanations. In Judaism, you don't acquire a person and dehumanize the person. People are not chattel. I used the word chattel before intentionally. People are not chattel. People are not just pure property. In Judaism, if you're going to bring somebody close to you and he's going to serve you, he's a human being. And as a human being, if you brought him close to you to serve you, you must enlighten him as to the laws of God. And you must make tevilah, make milah, and bring him to a knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? If you can't do that, then don't bring this person into your life and don't make this person your servant. Because if you make this person your servant and it's a pure piece of property, then you're actually violating the Torah. That's the slavery of the Goyim. The servitude of the Jewish people is a completely different thing. So for Avraham Avinu, acquiring people as servants and as maids is equivalent for us to bringing people to the Shekhinah and bringing people to the true servitude of the Almighty. Because the servitude of man is nothing, for we are all obliged and are committed to subject ourselves to the kingdom of God. So if I was to bring a slave and say, he's my slave, he belongs to me, I'll tell him what to do, I'm being arrogant, because I myself am a servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I'm part of the kingdom of God, and as such, I must show proper homage to God. So when I bring somebody in, I say, no, I'm not the ultimate master. The ultimate master is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was the knowledge that Abraham Avinu gave to his servants. So these were people that joined Abraham Avinu. Perhaps Abraham Avinu actually purchased them. Maybe back then people would sell themselves into slavery because they were destitute, because they had nothing to eat. It was common. It wasn't a brutal act. In the case of American slavery, I know that it was often done, probably more times than not, and I'm not familiar with the history, but certainly done, in a more brutal fashion, where people would be kidnapped away from their houses and brought to the U.S. But in antiquity, it oftentimes happened that a person who was destitute and had nothing to eat would sell himself into the servitude or slavery. If he was unlucky, he would be a slave of a regular individual. If he was blessed by God, Abraham Avinu would buy him, and he would become part of the household of Abraham Avinu, and therefore Abraham Avinu would feed him and clothe him and show him the proper love and respect that is part of the Jewish ethos that we show to other human beings, right? And as such, Abraham Avinu also raised them in the Torah and Mitzvot that Abraham Avinu himself knew. So he wouldn't just feed them physical food, but he gave them knowledge. And that's from where the law of Avadim, Hilchot Avadim, comes from. The law that you must make Tevilah and Milah on the Avadim is an extension of how Abraham Avinu used to treat these people that were destitute and were looking for food. He gave them more than just physical sustenance. He gave them spiritual gentrification. And these people were the original monotheists that believed in one God and that propagated the message of the true one God throughout humanity.